The sound of bustling traffic filled the air, the hum of engines, the screech of tires, and the occasional honk of horns. In the middle of it all, there was a moment of calm, a man in a wheelchair, waiting patiently at a busy crosswalk. His hands rested gently on the wheels, his eyes scanning the crowd, seemingly unaware of the hectic pace around him. He had learned long ago that, in the chaos of the world, sometimes all you could do was take your time, observe, and look for the small moments of kindness that could make a difference. Today, he wasn't just going to observe. Today, he would act. On the other side of the street, an elderly woman stood, her hand gripping her cane as she hesitated at the curb. The traffic was thick, the streets alive with movement, but she had no way of knowing when it would be safe to cross. Her frail frame seemed to shrink even further as the cars zoomed by, some barely missing her as she waited, unsure. You could see the fear in her eyes as she looked left, then right, then left again. Time seemed to stand still for her, each passing second adding to her anxiety. Her legs were tired, her heart racing a little faster than it should. In that moment, something incredible happened. The man in the wheelchair, who had been watching from a distance, suddenly wheeled himself forward. His movements were slow and steady, yet there was a sense of purpose in each rotation of the wheels. As he approached the curb, he locked eyes with the woman. There was a soft understanding between them. He could see the uncertainty in her, the weight of time and age pressing down on her, and he knew exactly what he needed to do. Without a second thought, he stopped in front of her, offering a kind smile. "Would you like some help crossing the street?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. The woman blinked in surprise, her tired eyes lighting up for a brief moment. She looked up at the man, unsure, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. A stranger, someone who appeared to be just as vulnerable in the world, was offering her help. There was hesitation, but only for a moment. The woman nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, please." And so, with quiet determination, the man gently guided her across the busy intersection. He maneuvered his wheelchair with grace and control, ensuring that he kept a steady pace despite the speeding cars around them. There was something unspoken in the way they moved together, an unexpected unity between two strangers. The woman, her grip now relaxed on her cane, found herself leaning just a little bit on him. There was comfort in the shared understanding, and as they made their way through the crosswalk, the man glanced at her, offering another reassuring smile. But what happened next was something neither of them could have predicted. As they reached the other side of the street, the elderly woman stopped suddenly. She looked at the man with eyes that seemed to hold an ocean of gratitude. Then, with shaking hands, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. It was simple, just a plain white envelope with no markings, but it seemed to carry a weight that could not be ignored. The woman's hands trembled as she held it out to him. "For you," she said softly. The man, confused but curious, took the envelope. It was warm to the touch, as if it had been in her possession for a long time. He carefully opened it, expecting nothing more than a note or perhaps a few kind words. But inside, nestled between the folds of paper, was something unexpected, something that made his heart skip a beat. It wasn't just money, but something far more precious, a ticket to a new beginning, something that could change his life in ways he had never dreamed of. He stared at the ticket in disbelief, his mind struggling to make sense of it. Why would this woman, a complete stranger, give him such a thing? What did she see in him that made her trust him with something so personal? Before he could even gather his thoughts, the elderly woman, her face soft with a lifetime of stories and experiences, smiled up at him. "I know what it feels like," she said, her voice trembling now with emotion. "You see, I was once where you are. And this is my way of giving back. I want you to have it. Use it wisely. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." The man felt the weight of her words sink deep into his chest. But what was this ticket, and how could he ever repay such an extraordinary kindness? The woman didn't wait for an answer. her face already turning as if she had said all she needed to say. She turned to walk away, her cane tapping gently against the sidewalk, leaving him standing there, stunned and unsure of what just happened. He looked down at the ticket once more, his mind racing. What had she meant by her words? What could a small piece of paper do to change the course of his life? And why had she trusted him with something so valuable, so full of promise? But just as quickly as the moment had come, it seemed to slip away. The woman had vanished into the crowd, her small frame swallowed by the busy street. The man's hands tightened around the ticket, his heart still pounding in his chest. There he was, standing in the middle of a bustling city, holding something that could potentially change his life forever. But what would he do with it? How could he make sense of the gift that had been given to him? And what would his next steps be, knowing that his path forward might not be the same as it had been just moments before? Stay tuned, because the story doesn't end here. In fact, it's only just beginning. The man stood motionless for several long moments, still gripping the envelope. The noise of the city around him seemed to fade away, as if the world had momentarily paused. His thoughts were clouded, confusion and disbelief swirling in his mind. What had just happened? Who was that woman? Why had she given him such an unusual gift? The questions flooded in faster than he could process them, leaving him feeling like he was caught in a dream, unsure whether to wake up or to keep going deeper into this strange turn of events. He glanced down at the ticket again, his fingers brushing over the smooth paper. There was no visible clue to what it was, just a few simple words printed on it. The text was a little faded, but legible. One chance, one life. Below the phrase, a small symbol that looked like an open door was etched in fine print. Nothing else. No name, no explanation. Just those cryptic words and the mysterious symbol that seemed to beckon him towards something unknown. As he stood there, his eyes darted around, half expecting to see the elderly woman reappear from the crowd. But she was gone, lost in the sea of people moving in every direction. The ticket in his hand seemed heavier now, as if it carried a burden he couldn't quite understand. The man shifted his weight in the wheelchair, still trying to shake the feeling of uncertainty that had settled over him. He had never been the type to believe in signs or fate, but something about this moment felt different. Something about the woman's words, the warmth in her eyes, made him wonder if this wasn't just a random encounter. She had known something about him, something he couldn't yet comprehend, and that knowledge made him uneasy. He wheeled himself slowly to the nearest bench, the weight of the ticket still pressing on his mind. Sitting down, he stared at it, as if it would suddenly reveal its meaning. But no answers came. The streets around him continued their chaotic rhythm, people rushing by, cars honking, the usual noise of the city. Yet he felt detached from it all, as though he were in a different world, one where he had just stepped into a story that was still unfolding. His thoughts drifted back to his own life. It hadn't been an easy journey. He'd spent most of his days in the same wheelchair, a victim of circumstances beyond his control. A car accident years ago had left him unable to walk, shattering his dreams and his sense of independence. His world had become smaller with each passing day, and his hopes had dimmed along with it. But the one thing he had always held on to was kindness. In a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving, he tried to be kind to others. He had learned early on that it was the one thing that kept him going, even on the darkest days. Perhaps that's why the woman had chosen him. Maybe she saw something in him, a kindness, a vulnerability, that made her want to share her gift. Or maybe, just maybe, this was the universe telling him that there was still hope for something greater. He ran his fingers over the ticket again, as if the sensation might trigger something inside him, something that would unlock the mystery. But still, nothing. Only that strange symbol. What did it mean? What could it possibly represent? After a while, he gave up trying to decipher the ticket. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe it was nothing more than a random act of kindness. But deep down, he knew there was more to it. He had to know more. Deciding that he needed a break from the bustling city, he wheeled himself away from the crowd and found a quieter part of the park nearby. It was a small oasis in the middle of the urban jungle, with a few benches under tall trees and a fountain bubbling softly in the distance. He settled in on one of the benches, taking a deep breath as he tried to clear his mind. His eyes drifted to the ticket again, and this time he noticed something new. On the back of the paper, there was a faint mark, a series of numbers and letters, barely visible to the naked eye. It almost seemed like a code, something meant to be deciphered. His heart raced as he leaned closer to inspect it, his hands trembling slightly. Could this be the key to unlocking the mystery? Could the answer lie in those numbers? With a sense of urgency, he pulled out his phone and snapped a quick photo of the mark. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he would find out. He had to. The ticket was no longer just a gift. It was a puzzle, a riddle that had to be solved. Hours passed as he researched the symbols and numbers, scanning the internet for anything that might give him a clue. But despite his best efforts, nothing came up. No matches, no relevant information. It was as if the mark didn't exist in any known database. Frustration began to set in, but he refused to give up. He wasn't going to let this slip through his fingers. There was something important here, something that connected him to that moment with the woman. Just as he was about to call it quits for the night, a new thought crossed his mind. What if the answer wasn't out there? What if the key was somewhere closer, something more personal? He had always believed that life's answers didn't come from a search on the internet, but from within, through connections with others, through experience. Maybe he needed to trust his instincts. He set the phone down and closed his eyes, thinking back to the woman. Her kindness, the way she had handed him the ticket without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. She had seen something in him, something that made her believe he was the right person for this challenge, whatever it was. As he sat there, deep in thought, a sudden voice interrupted his reverie. "Excuse me, is everything all right?" A man asked, his voice gentle but curious. The man in the wheelchair looked up, startled, and saw a stranger standing in front of him. The man was younger than him, dressed casually, with a kind smile on his face. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking," the man in the wheelchair replied, his voice a little shaky. "You seem a bit lost in thought," the stranger observed. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help but notice that you're holding something. Looks like it could be important." The man glanced down at the ticket in his hand, still holding it tightly. He had no idea why this stranger was speaking to him, but for some reason, something inside him clicked. Maybe this was the person who could help him understand what was happening. I think it is important," he said slowly, meeting the stranger's eyes. "I don't know what it means, but I feel like I have to figure it out." The stranger nodded knowingly. "Sometimes the answers come when you least expect them. Maybe you're on the right path already." The man in the wheelchair looked up at him, unsure. What did this man know? Was he just another passerby with some words of wisdom, or was there something more to this conversation? Before he could ask, the stranger smiled again and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. But the words lingered in the air, echoing in the man's mind. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone in this as he thought. The words from the stranger echoed in the man's mind long after he had walked away. "Maybe you're on the right path already." It was such a simple statement, yet it felt laden with meaning, as if it were the missing piece of the puzzle he had been trying to solve for days. But what did it mean? What was this path he was supposed to be on? For the first time since the woman had handed him the ticket, a small spark of hope ignited in his chest. He had spent so much time analyzing the cryptic message, trying to make sense of the numbers and symbols. But maybe, just maybe, he wasn't supposed to figure it all out on his own. Maybe the key was to trust his instincts and follow whatever feelings this ticket stirred in him. But even as that hope flickered, doubt lingered. What if he was just chasing shadows, looking for meaning where there was none? Still, he couldn't ignore the pull to follow this strange journey. After all, It wasn't every day that a complete stranger gave you something so valuable, something that felt like it had the power to change everything. The days that followed were a blur. The man tried to return to his normal routine, but it was impossible to focus on anything else. The ticket haunted him, its strange promise never leaving his side. He had told himself that he would try to let it go, that he would forget about it and move on. But every time he touched the envelope, he was reminded of the woman's words. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. It wasn't long before he couldn't ignore it any longer. The ticket, the woman's gift, the cryptic symbol, they were all starting to feel like a force he couldn't outrun. It was like a puzzle that had already been started, but now it was up to him to finish it. He had no choice but to continue down this path, whatever it might lead to. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, the man found himself standing at the same busy intersection where he had met the woman days before. The ticket burned in his pocket, its presence a constant reminder of the mystery that had taken hold of his life. It was a quiet moment, the street lights flickering on, casting a warm glow over the pavement. For a brief second, everything felt still. But then, as he looked around, he caught sight of something that made his heart race. In the distance, he saw a woman standing at the same corner where he had met the elderly lady. She was older, frailer, her clothes tattered from time and use. She held a cane in her hand, much like the first woman had, and she seemed to be waiting for something, her gaze focused on the street ahead of her. The man's pulse quickened as he wheeled himself toward her. It wasn't the same woman, but something about her posture, the way she stood so uncertain in the face of the passing cars. It was like a mirror of the first encounter. Could this be another test? Was this woman connected to the first one, part of a bigger plan he couldn't yet understand? He didn't hesitate. His instincts kicked in, and before he could talk himself out of it, he was at her side, offering his help. "Can I help you cross the street?" he asked, his voice steady but urgent. The woman turned to look at him, her face a map of wrinkles and stories, her eyes clouded with years of hardship. She nodded, her lips parting slightly in a faint, grateful smile. "Yes, please," she said softly, her voice thick with age and fatigue. As they moved across the street, the man felt a strange sense of déjà vu wash over him. The noise of the cars seemed to fade, the crowd blending into the background as he focused solely on guiding this woman to safety. It was as if time had stretched, repeating itself in this one brief moment. And yet, something felt different this time, like the air was charged with anticipation, as if the universe itself were holding its breath. When they reached the other side, the woman's hands trembled slightly as she clutched his arm for support. She looked up at him, her gaze piercing and intense, and for a moment, it was like she saw right through him, into his very soul. "You've done this before, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low and knowing. The man paused, taken aback. "What do you mean?" he asked, his heart beginning to race. She smiled, a knowing smile, the kind of smile that only someone who had lived through decades of life could give. "The way you moved, the way you helped me. There's a strength in you. It's the same strength that you gave to the woman before me." His breath caught in his throat. How did she know about the first woman? Was it a coincidence, or was there something more at play here than he realized? Before he could speak, the woman reached into her coat pocket, her hands shaking as she pulled out something small, wrapped in an old faded cloth. She handed it to him with surprising strength for her age. The man took it cautiously, unraveling the cloth to reveal a small key. It was simple, made of old brass, but there was something incredibly meaningful about it. The key felt heavy in his palm, as if it held the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions. "This is yours," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "It belongs to you now." The man's mind reeled. Another gift, another piece of the puzzle. What was it for? What door would this key unlock? Before he could ask another question, the woman turned away, her steps slow and deliberate, as she made her way down the sidewalk, her figure disappearing into the night. The man stood there, holding the key in his hand, his heart pounding with anticipation. What was going on? What was the meaning of all this? Why had these women appeared in his life, and why had they given him these strange, seemingly insignificant objects? The questions seemed to multiply by the second, each one more urgent than the last. And yet, as the key grew heavier in his palm, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening, he was getting closer to an answer. The feeling was undeniable. There was a door, somewhere, and it was waiting for him. But where? And how would he find it? As he wheeled himself back to the park, the world around him felt like it was closing in, the weight of the mystery pressing down on him. The ticket, the key, the words from the stranger, everything was leading him toward something. But what? What would he find when he reached the end of this strange, twisting journey? He couldn't know yet, but one thing was clear. The moment of truth was fast approaching, and everything was about to change. The man couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on him, like the walls were slowly tightening around him, pushing him toward an inevitable conclusion. His mind raced as he made his way back to the park, the key still heavy in his pocket, the ticket folded neatly in his hand. He couldn't understand what was happening, but the sense of urgency, the sense that everything was connected, was overwhelming. He felt as if he were being led down a path that had been laid out for him long before he had ever walked it. The key, the ticket, the encounters with the elderly women. It was all so surreal. And yet, deep down, he knew this wasn't just coincidence. Something far bigger was at play, and he could feel it closing in on him. He found a bench in the park and sat down, staring out at the city skyline. The quiet of the evening seemed to amplify the noise in his head, each unanswered question echoing louder than the last. What was the key for? What was the door he was supposed to open? Where did all this fit into his life? Suddenly, a shadow appeared in front of him, blocking his view of the skyline. The man looked up, startled, to see a tall figure standing before him. He hadn't noticed anyone approach. The stranger wore a dark coat, his face obscured by the brim of a hat, and his posture was unnervingly still, almost predatory. "Are you the one with the key?" the man asked, his voice calm but tinged with apprehension. The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, lowering his head so that his face was no longer hidden in shadow. And when he spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, as if it carried with it a warning that had yet to be fully understood. "You've been chosen," the stranger said, his eyes piercing the man's soul. "Chosen for something. Something much larger than you can comprehend." The man's heart skipped a beat. His fingers tightened around the key in his pocket, a strange chill creeping up his spine. "Chosen for what?" he asked, his voice shaky now. The stranger smiled, though it wasn't a kind smile. It was cold, calculating, as if he knew the answer already and was simply waiting for the man to catch up. "The key you hold doesn't just open any door. It opens the door to your destiny." The man's mind spun. This was the second time in as many days that someone had spoken as though they knew more about him than he did. And now this stranger was claiming that he was chosen for something. What could this possibly mean? Was this part of some elaborate test, or was there something deeper at play? "I don't understand," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just trying to figure this out." The stranger stepped closer, his presence imposing. "You've already begun the journey, whether you realize it or not. And now, the choice is yours. You can either follow this path, or you can turn away. But understand this, you cannot go back. The door has already been unlocked." At that moment, the man's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, distracted by the unexpected interruption. It was a message. No name attached, just the message itself. "You are being watched. They know. Trust no one." His heart dropped. Who could have sent this? What did it mean? And why did it feel like it was tied to everything that had been happening? He glanced up at the stranger, his eyes wide with fear. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling now. "Who are you?" The stranger's face darkened. "You shouldn't have gotten that message," he said, his voice sharp. "They are getting closer. You've attracted their attention. They won't stop until they have what they're looking for." The woman's lips curled into a small smile. "I'm the one who's been watching you, and you've been playing right into our hands." The man's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I don't." She raised her hand, cutting him off. "You've been chosen, just like the others. For years, we've been tracking people like you. People who have the potential to unlock something greater than themselves, something that's been hidden for centuries." The man felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. The others, what was she talking about? Had everything, the ticket, the key, the cryptic messages, been part of some grand scheme? He had trusted these signs, believed that they were leading him to something important, but now it felt as though he had been a pawn all along. "You've been set up," the woman continued, her eyes narrowing. "You think the key is the answer, but it's not. It's just the beginning." Suddenly, the man felt a sharp pain in his chest, and before he could react, the woman moved swiftly, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling the key from his hand. He flinched, but it was too late. The key was gone. She held it in front of him, turning it over in her hands, her expression darkening. "You're not the first one to come this far. You're just the latest in a long line of people who've been deceived by this illusion of choice," she said, her voice cold. "We've been waiting for you." The man stumbled back, his mind racing. Deceived. All this time, he had thought he was making choices, deciding for himself. But now, it seemed like everything had been orchestrated from the start. Was this a game to them? Had they been controlling everything all along? Before he could gather his thoughts, the woman's expression shifted. A smirk played at the corners of her mouth as she looked past him. "It's time." Confused, the man turned around, his eyes scanning the area. That's when he saw them. More figures emerging from the darkness, their movements deliberate, methodical. They surrounded him. A chill ran through his spine. They were everywhere, and there was no escape. In that moment, everything he had thought he knew about this situation came crashing down. The key, the ticket, the mysterious messages, they weren't meant to guide him toward something good. They were traps, and he had fallen right into them. "You've been used," the woman said again, her voice now filled with an eerie finality. "The key is just a tool. It doesn't open a door. It opens a cage." The words struck him like a physical blow. A cage. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked around frantically. Was this all some kind of twisted experiment? Had he been manipulated into thinking he was part of something grand, when in reality, he was just another victim? But then, something unexpected happened. As the woman held the key up, a faint glow began to emanate from it, pulsing like a heartbeat. The man blinked, confused. What was this? The key shouldn't be glowing. It was just a metal object. But the glow was undeniable, and as it flickered, he felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic force that drew him closer to it. Suddenly, the man's eyes widened in realization. The key wasn't just a tool for unlocking a physical door. It was a key to something deeper, to him. As he took a step forward, the woman's eyes widened in shock. "No, you don't understand. You." But before she could finish, the man reached out and grabbed the key from her hand, the glow intensifying in his grip. And in that instant, everything around him changed. A blinding light exploded from the key, flooding the entire area with its brilliance. The figures around him recoiled, their faces twisted in fear and anger, as though they had underestimated the power of the very thing they had been using all along. The man's vision blurred, and the air itself seemed to shimmer and warp, the world distorting before his eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. The man stood alone, the key still in his hand, but the figures were gone. The woman had disappeared. Everything had gone silent. For a long moment he simply stood there, his mind reeling from what had just happened. Had he just unlocked something? Something real, or had it all been a trick? But as he looked around, his chest still heavy with confusion, he realized that the key had led him to this moment. And though the path ahead remained unclear, one thing was certain. The game had changed, and he was no longer the pawn. The silence that followed the flash of light felt like an eternity. The man stood frozen, clutching the key in his hand, still trying to process everything that had just unfolded. His heart beat erratically, a sense of disbelief settling in as he tried to make sense of the chaos. The figures, the woman, the cryptic messages. It all seemed so surreal. What had just happened? What had he unlocked? Was it really over, or was this just another part of the game? He looked around, half expecting the shadowy figures to reappear, but the park was eerily quiet. The streets, once bustling with people, were now deserted, as if the world itself had paused to catch its breath. The glow from the key had faded, leaving only the cold, hard metal in his hand. Yet it still felt like there was something more, something beyond what he could see. Taking a deep breath, he sat down on the nearby bench, the key resting in his palm. As he stared at it, he began to realize that this moment was more than just an end. It was a beginning. Everything that had led him to this point, every twist, every encounter, had been preparing him for something bigger. But what? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the key had opened something inside of him, something he hadn't known was there. The messages, the ticket, the stranger in the park, they had all been part of a puzzle. But what did it all mean? And why had it all felt so urgent? He felt a pang of frustration. The answers weren't coming easily. He had hoped that unlocking the key would bring clarity, but instead, he found himself even more confused than before. He was left with more questions than ever. But then, a thought struck him. What if the answers weren't in the key itself? What if they were inside of him all along? He had been seeking answers from everyone else, relying on strangers and cryptic messages to guide him. But what if the power to understand it all was within him? What if the key had only unlocked his own potential, the ability to make decisions for himself, to trust his instincts, to find the answers he was looking for within? A sense of calm washed over him. It was as if the weight of the confusion that had gripped him for so long had been lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of clarity. He didn't need to understand everything all at once. He didn't need to know every detail of the game or why he had been chosen. What mattered was that he was in control now. The key had unlocked his awareness, his ability to choose his own path. And in that moment, he realized that the real power wasn't in the key. It was in the choices he made moving forward. The man stood up slowly, the cool evening air brushing against his face. He looked out at the city, the distant lights flickering like stars in the night sky. The world was still there, unchanged, waiting for him to step back into it. He felt a sense of connection, a sense of possibility, as if the world had opened up to him in ways he hadn't imagined. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a new message, but this time, there was no cryptic warning or hidden agenda. The message was simple, direct. The door is open. It's time to choose. For the first time, the man smiled. He didn't need to rush to make a decision. The choice was his, and that was enough. He had the power to shape his future now, to move forward with purpose, not as a pawn in someone else's game, but as the master of his own destiny. He looked down at the key one last time, and then, without hesitation, he slipped it into his pocket. The key was no longer the symbol of something to be unlocked. It was a reminder of the journey he had just taken, and the one that lay ahead. As he walked away from the park, the city's lights guiding his way, he knew that he had left behind the confusion and uncertainty of the past. What lay ahead was unknown, but he was ready to face whatever challenges came his way, to make his own decisions, and to embrace the power of choice. For the first time, he felt free. Free from the games, the manipulation, the uncertainty, and free to live his life on his own terms. And with each step, he moved closer to the future he was going to create, no longer trapped in the web of deception, but moving forward into a world where the only thing that mattered was his own path. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth it. And as the night stretched on, he knew that the real key had always been within him all along. The game was over. Now, the real adventure was just beginning.